Really great to have you here for this daytime presentation with Marina von Neumann Whitman. We call these our sound bites, our midday events, and we're just delighted to have so many of you here today. I want to welcome you on behalf of the trustees, our staff, and our incredible volunteers. Now let me introduce today's guest. In his 1999 autobiography, the physicist Edward Teller wrote this of the group of geniuses gathered together to work on the hydrogen bomb. We are Martians who have come to Earth to change everything. Change everything they did, and among them, of course, was the brilliant mathematician John von Neumann, father of what we now call the von Neumann architecture for modern computing, and of course, so much more. Today is not necessarily about John von Neumann, of course, but it is about a Martian's daughter, Marina von Neumann Whitman, whose own great intellect and considerable business talent have been applied to other economic, social, and education frontiers in our country for almost 40 years. In her new autobiography, The Martian's Daughter, Marina recounts what it was like to grow up in her unique family and then to continue to break new ground as a talented and credentialed woman, making it certainly in some of the most male-dominated boardrooms, classrooms, and org charts of some of the most storied institutions in America. Marina was leaning in long before the phrase leaning in hit the popular vernacular. She is professor of business administration and public policy at the University of Michigan, a former vice president and chief economist of General Motors. She was the first woman appointed to the President's Council of Economic Advisors. In 1972-73, she took that post from her academic position at Pitt. She is now retired, but had long years of very distinguished service on the boards of directors of Alcoa, J.P. Morgan Chase, Procter & Gamble. She serves on the boards of Harvard and Princeton and of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which is, of course, chaired by our good friend Charles Simoni, and she holds honorary degrees from more than 20 colleges and universities. Quite a woman, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome her now. Please, Marina von Neumann Whitman. Well, welcome.
It's wonderful to be here.
Thanks.
And I must say, this is a fabulous museum. I've had a sort of mini tour. I think actually the full tour would take days and days, but it's pretty exciting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was so much fun to take you around this morning and, of course, to look at what we call the Johnny-ac, but I know that was not your father's favorite phrase for that computer.
Well, he liked it, but the Institute for Advanced Study thought it wasn't dignified enough.
Okay.
So that's why it became the IAS machine, which I think is much more boring than Johnny-ac.
You've written a heck of a book. I just loved it, and there's so much ground to cover in this. But let's start at the beginning, not long before that picture that's there behind us and is on the cover of the book was taken. You had, everyone I'm sure is going to want to know about the time that you spent with your father and your memories of him. But let's start with your mother and your father, because your mother was every bit as remarkable a person in her own way.
That's true. That's absolutely true. She was very smart, very glamorous. She had a career that she never intended to and kind of made up as she went along. And although she isn't noted as much in things written about the book, she also was a very important influence.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about her influence, both on you and on John.
Well, they actually, I think, grew up together in Budapest. The family lore has it that they met when she was 3 and he was 6 or 7 at a birthday party. And then, somewhat later, obviously, they did what I guess today would be called dating, although my mother was very carefully chaperoned. And then in 1930, my father was invited to, as a Rockefeller Fellow, to teach 1 term a year at Princeton. And he wanted my mother to come with him, and obviously that meant getting married. So they did, and my mother, I think, first of all, he was pretty fascinating. He was young, he was handsome, he was brilliant. And besides, she had very overprotective parents, and I honestly think that she was very happy to put an ocean between them. And they her parents never came here until 1939 when my father said, look, there's going to be a war. You mustn't, saying to my mother, they were divorced, but she still took his advice. And he said, you mustn't go to Hungary. So she said to her parents, well, if you want to see us this year, you have to come here. Well, they were sure they were going to be scalped by wild Indians, but they did come for what they thought was a 6-week summer vacation, and of course, they never went back.
They couldn't go back to Europe at that point.
No, they couldn't go back to Europe. I mean, they came in June, I guess, and war broke out in August, so obviously they couldn't go back. And so they spent the rest of their lives here, and I guess one of the reasons, well, my mother went to work during World War II for several reasons. One is that it was unpatriotic not to, and also she had suddenly the financial responsibility for her parents and her aunt who had also come. So she felt she ought to at least make a significant contribution to supporting them. So she went to work as a kind of Tilly the Toiler, and within 3 months she was a foreman, and within 6 months she was supervising the women technicians at radiation laboratory at MIT where they built radar sets. And after that, she kind of never looked back.
I think it's fascinating, 3 very strong-willed, intelligent women in your father's background. One Mariette, your mother, one Clary, your stepmother, and one you. Now, how did he deal with all of this as a husband and father and intellect?
As far as wives went, he dealt very badly. He was a very gregarious person, but he never really got the hang of marriage. And my mother ultimately divorced him, and when it's said that when she was asked why she divorced this great genius and married a graduate student in physics, she said, well, how would you like to be married to a national monument? But the truth is that although they divorced, they kind of maintained a lifetime flirtation relationship which drove their spouses crazy. When she was sitting out the 6 weeks in Reno getting her divorce, she would write him letters about what a dreadful place this was, and she would sign off saying, do you love me just a little bit? Love Mariette. And, she was divorcing him.
Sure.
So it was an oddball relationship. My stepmother was very intelligent. She never had formal education beyond high school, beyond boarding school in England. But when my father built the stored program computer, she actually became one of the first programmers and did some pretty fancy programming. Unfortunately, she was also terribly neurotic, terribly insecure. Every day that he was away from her, he would write her a letter apologizing for some perceived sin or other. And she was also very insecure. Sadly, she ultimately committed suicide, as her father had. When I lived with them when I was in high school, she tried very hard to form a good relationship with me, but the truth was that she was not easy to get along with. And now, of course, in my old age, I have enormous sympathy for her, but back then as an adolescent, I was pretty impatient.
Mm-hmm. Now, your mother and father had a very unusual arrangement for you personally after they divorced, and it was not one you knew about. She was to have custody of you up to a point, and then he was to have custody from that point on.
That's right. The agreement was, and I have the divorce agreement in my safe deposit box, that until I was roughly 12 or 13, I would live with my mother during the school year and spend vacations with my father. And then when I more or less reached high school years, the situation would be reversed. Their reasoning was apparently that, of course, anybody who was John von Neumann's daughter should have an opportunity to know him well. But they also thought that he would handle better a relationship with me once I'd reached the age of reason. Now, what they didn't know, because they were too young and inexperienced, was that probably the stage of life furthest from the age of reason is a teenage adolescent.
Preteen girls are the biggest Martians of all, I think.
There you are, exactly. So in that sense, it was a mistake, but it was extremely well-intentioned. However, they neglected to tell me about this. I don't think they neglected. I think they were nervous about it. So when this got sprung on me, I was pretty testy about it.
Yeah.
Because I thought, geez, it would have been good of you to tell me. But, I acquiesced and I went off to live in Princeton. And as I say, that had its complications, but it did give me a chance to interact much more with my father than I could have otherwise. Partly because those vacations I spent with him, certainly during World War II, were mostly spent without him because he was always either in Los Alamos or on a secret trip to England in the middle of the war and so forth. It also gave me a chance to go to a really terrific school. It was something that doesn't exist much now, a sort of all-girls private school. And we had teachers who today would be doctors or lawyers or professors in university, but in those days, those options weren't open to them. So we had these absolutely brilliant women teaching us. And I have to say that when I got to Harvard, it seemed easy in comparison to what was demanded of me at, of all things, Miss Fine's school, which is now merged with a boys' school and it's called the Princeton Day School, but is still an outstanding school.
So your father arrives at Princeton. He's instantly a sensation. In fact, I think the quote in your book is that the department at Princeton was divided into three categories in mathematics. There were the theoretical mathematicians, there were the physicists, and then there was John von Neumann. Were you aware of that? Did you have any understanding of your father and his
No,
work?
I knew that he was a pretty hotshot mathematician. I don't think I was aware of how much he bridged over into physics until I became aware of the existence of the mathematical foundations of quantum mechanics. I can't say I've ever read it, but at some point I became aware that he did bridge those two fields. And of course, after the war was over, I learned something about the Manhattan Project and what he'd done there. But it really wasn't until I went off to college that I began to be more aware of what a remarkable person he was. And you know, his name didn't become that much of a household word while he was still alive. That really happened after his death, beginning with a famous obituary article in Life magazine right after he died. So a lot of this I sort of became more aware of as a young adult.
Do you remember when it started to become clear to you? You said you were in college when suddenly, I think as many children do, I mean, you're slightly aware in many cases what your mother and father do, but then all of a sudden, if it's something remarkable, maybe the clouds begin to part a bit and there it is. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. I remember it through sort of anecdotes or incidents. I remember when I was first starting to date the man who became my husband, Bob Whitman,
Bob, who's here
sitting
today.
over here. Yes.
Absolutely.
And we were down in Harvard Square having coffee or something, and he introduced me to a fellow graduate student in the math department, and he said, "This is Marina von Neumann." And the young man said, "Not the von Neumann." And Bob says, I modestly batted my eyelashes and said yes. And Bob, who was getting a PhD in England, thought, gee whiz, who is the von Neumann? And so it was really in the Harvard environment that all this kind of solidified. Mm-hmm. And later, and this is a story I tell in my book, I am undoubtedly the most mathematically illiterate economist on the planet.
I think that's fascinating.
I could no more pass general exams for the PhD in economics now than I could fly, because it's really applied mathematics. And there's a reason for it. Directly, my father, although he never knew it, was responsible for this. Great irony. Because when I went to Harvard, the first term I took calculus 1A, and that was fine. It was okay. It wasn't my most exciting course, but it wasn't my hardest one either. And I fully intended to go on to calculus 1B. But one day, Harvard in those days had a sort of month between terms. And I was walking down a hallway somewhere, and I ran into the chairman of the Harvard mathematics department, who was a very well-known mathematician in his own right, and actually had published a paper or two with my father. And I'm sure he thought he was just making small talk with this 17-year-old, and he said, "Oh, Marina, I'm so glad you upheld the family honor by getting an A in calculus." And I thought to myself, oh my God, what happens to the family honor if I ever get an A- in calculus? And from that day to this, I have never taken another math course for credit. I could not take the risk. I have audited math courses. I've forced my way through textbooks when I was feeding my firstborn in the middle of the night, but my last recorded credit in math, it's calculus 1A. So.
And therefore the family honor's fully intact.
Fully intact, that's right.
You tell some fascinating stories, too, about the dinner guests at John von Neumann's house. So when you were growing up, who are the people who would just drop by for dinner?
Oh, well, yes. Well, the obvious, the Edward Tellers and the Norbert Wieners and Eugene Wigners and so forth. I think Einstein used to come to dinner, but by the time I became conscious, his wife had died and had become something of a recluse. So I only saw him when I went to the 4 o'clock teas that the Institute for Advanced Study had every day. But all the people who came to dinner were not necessarily all mathematicians. I still remember Arthur Koestler, the famous writer who wrote these vehemently anti-communist. He had been a communist and then wrote some very vehement and very dark anti-communist novels. And Oscar Morgenstern, of course, the economist who wrote The Theory of Games with my father, and who actually courted his very beautiful bride in our living room. So there were all these fascinating intellects around the dinner table. And of course, I got terribly impatient with these long dinners because I just wanted to get upstairs and finish my homework so I could get on the phone with my friends. So I was, to put it mildly, not terribly appreciative about what was going on around me. And it's only looking back that I realized what a crowd this was.
Now, your father was a prolific letter writer, and it's come out as people are now beginning to document his life, how many letters he wrote and how many people he wrote to, and how much he used that as a way of really working out in his own mind a lot of the thoughts that he was trying to work out.
He did. Sometimes they were mathematical thoughts when he was writing to colleagues, and sometimes they were very personal knots. As I mentioned, he wrote, whenever he was away, he wrote to my stepmother, and it was always either apologizing for something he had or hadn't done, or trying to reassure her because she was so terribly insecure. And he wrote wonderful letters to me, which would jump from one subject to another without a blip. Sometimes very personal letters, because he was very unhappy that I was planning to get married right out of college. Actually, I was a whole week out of college. Not because he objected to my husband. He quite liked Bob, but he thought that any woman who tied herself down to early marriage in the 1950s was destroying any possibility of having a career of her own, and he felt very strongly about making use of one's intellectual talents. So he wrote me these very desperate letters about, don't tie yourself down, don't do this so early.
Well, and I think what comes through in those letters as well is that he knew you had special capabilities. I mean, he really saw the intellectual promise in you, and that meant a lot to him, it seems.
Oh, it did. I mean, he used to worry a lot, partly when he knew he was going to die so young, but even before, he sort of worried about his legacy. And I guess there were two aspects to his legacy. One was his work, and he worried a great deal whether 100 years after his death anybody would be paying attention. And the other was me. I was his only child, and therefore, in a sense, his link to the future, which clearly he wasn't going to have. And I suppose there was a certain amount of plain old parental pride, but also I was a very good student, and I was always first in my class and this and that. And so he expected great things of me, and of course, in a statistical sense, in the 1950s, he was absolutely right that women who got married early sort of became mired in domesticity, and that was that. And of course, he never lived long enough. I mean, I was 21 when he died, so I hadn't done much of anything yet. And all my life, I've really wanted to be able to say to him, you see, I did what I wanted, but I've also done what you wanted. So it did all come together, but of course I never had that chance.
Now you have become the collector and in some ways the curator of all this correspondence. And the second set of letters, which I think came to light because of George Dyson, maybe they were known about before, but certainly George writes in riveting terms in Turing's Cathedral about this rusty, upright filing cabinet in your basement next to the boiler. As George put it in his book, it's always next to the boiler, whatever it is.
That's right.
Of all the letters that were exchanged between John and Clary during all those years.
That's right. There was, as I said, he wrote to her constantly. Many of them were in Hungarian, but some of them were in English. And once, long before I had ever looked through them, our son, who was then probably in his 20s or something, looked through them. He didn't read Hungarian, so he just looked at the ones in English. And I said, well, what are you finding there? And he said very simply, a portrait of a disintegrating marriage. And that wasn't far off. I mean, they, in fact, stayed married, and once my father was very ill, my stepmother became a very caring caretaker and so forth. But there's no question that it was, in many ways, a very dysfunctional relationship. And that's a lot of what's in those letters. There's also some other things. There's a diagram of what George thinks is the diagram of the computer that was built at the Institute. I wouldn't know one way or another, but George got quite excited.
He did. He found another piece of paper which was crumpled but then smoothed back out, which was, he thinks, maybe one of the first pieces of code ever written for any computer.
That's right. That's right.
Did, now you obviously have become very familiar, certainly, with everything that he did, but also you have a real sense of history, I can tell just by talking with you and what you write in the book, about his role in the history of computing and in game theory and all the other path-breaking work that he did. How much of that have you seen as part of your life's work?
As part of my life's work?
Yes.
Well, really, not at all. I mean, ironically, when I decided to go into economics, and initially I intended to get a master's in economics and one in journalism and, write articles for the New York Times or the Economist or something, and it wasn't until Gary Becker gave me a fellowship and talked me into going for the PhD that I really became an economist. But I was so naive that I didn't really realize how much my father had done in the field of economics. I mean, game theory really hadn't been taken up by economics yet, and I don't think I was aware of the Turnpike theorem. I'm sure if I'd realized how much my father had contributed to the field I was going into, I would have chosen a different field. But I honestly was ignorant, and by the time I found out, it was too late.
Yeah, life's work is probably not the right phrase. Not that you've devoted a tremendous amount of time to this, but you certainly have an awareness, and you're on the board at the IAS. I mean, it's a thread that you can never break, but also you've taken this on as a dimension, I think.
Oh, that's true, yes, and it is quite remarkable to sit on the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Advanced Study, where my father was one of the 5 founding members, and to sort of feel his astonished ghost looking down on me there. So yes, in that sense, and I've tried to be responsive when people have wanted to know things about my father or asked to reprint something he'd written and so forth. I try to respond to these things. And in 2003, which was the 100th anniversary of his birth, I went all over Hungary giving talks about him, and in high schools, some of them named after him, and I was absolutely astounded that these high school students sort of revered John von Neumann with the kind of awe that in the US high school students would reserve for an athlete or a pop singer, and I was just astounded that these kids knew about him, they'd done research, and I'm going to Hungary in June, in about 2 months, I guess, for the opening of a new computer museum in Hungary, in Szeged, which is the second biggest city there. Mm-hmm. And again, there'll be a room devoted to von Neumann, and they've asked me to be part of the opening. And I secretly, or not so secretly, hope maybe I can persuade somebody to translate my book into Hungarian. So, you know, I mean, particularly after his death, I have, in a way, become the keeper of the flame. Mm-hmm. A little bit to my surprise, but there it is.
Do you feel history is now coming to meet him? Do you think that his role and his accomplishments and the singular place that he occupies is becoming better known now?
That may be for a couple of reasons. One is that he was truly a polymath, and that's sort of a pun, because what I mean by that is he made his mark in a wide variety of fields in both pure and applied mathematics. And a lot of people wonder, given the way the field has multiplied, that if ever again anybody could do that in as many areas as he did. And of course, the other thing is that with quite a delay, game theory has now become a major tool in the social sciences. Even though that seminal book was called The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, it really wasn't taken up for at least 20 years by economics and other social sciences. It was taken up mainly by the military and by the Rand Corporation, which did analysis for the military. But it came quite late to economics, and now to some extent also to political science, and interestingly enough, to biology. And because that happened with a delay, but it did happen again, more people are aware of him than would be otherwise. I think the computer scientists always were, but that doesn't mean that the economists and the political scientists and the molecular biologists were, which many of them are now. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a perfect way to make the transition to your career, because I do want to spend the balance of the time on that, because it is so fascinating. You mentioned going to Columbia and studying with the Nobel laureate Gary Becker, received your PhD, went to Pitt, and were on the faculty there at Pitt. But I want to pick up the story really with you going to the White House to be on the staff of the Council for the Economic Advisors. Now let me point out that today, as we sit here in 2013, no one really talks about the Council of Economic Advisors that much anymore. But during the 70s, the CEA was a big deal because of the things that President Nixon wanted to try to do.
It was. Can I backtrack just a minute?
Absolutely.
And tell one anecdote about why it is that I got a PhD at Columbia. Bob was teaching at Princeton, and I had a job at the Educational Testing Service when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school. And Bert Malkiel, a friend of mine who's famous for having written A Random Walk Down Wall Street, and I decided we would like to go and get PhDs in economics at Princeton. And the economics department welcomed us both enthusiastically, but I was told there was one little problem. Women were not accepted at Princeton, even in graduate school, and so I would have to go and talk to the president. The president had been president for about 20 years, and he was about to retire, and that conversation did not go well. He first responded by saying, "Oh, Mrs. Whitman, I'm so sorry we can't accept a student of your caliber, but unfortunately we don't have housing for women students." And I said, "Well, President Dodds, fortunately that's not a problem, because my husband is an instructor at Princeton and we live in the leftover World War II barracks that Princeton was housing its very junior faculty in. By the way, those barracks, which were supposed to be torn down after the war, are actually going to be torn down next year. At least that's what they say." So after I made this point about housing, there was a long silence. And then he said, "Oh, Mrs. Whitman, we really wish we could accept you in our PhD program, but unfortunately we simply don't have enough facilities for women students. So for the lack of ladies' rooms, I had to commute to Columbia to get my PhD, which I did." Okay, now back.
So, ironically, of von Neumann not being able to get into Princeton to study economics.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Back to the Nixon White House.
Yes.
Well, the importance of the CEA has tended to rise and fall with the kind of personal relationship that the chairman had with the president. And at that time, there were a string of CEA chairmen, starting with, I guess, Arthur Okun and Walter Heller, with John Kennedy and Johnson, and then McCracken and also George Shultz with Nixon. And Nixon, there were two big events that cast economics into the forefront. And one was when the United States was having all kinds of problems with the Bretton Woods Agreement, which worked just fine. The theory was that the world would operate on a dollar standard and the dollar would operate on more or less a gold standard, and so the countries that wanted to trade dollars for gold could do that when they asked. The system worked just great as long as nobody asked. But in 1972, the United States trade deficit, current account deficit, was getting bigger and bigger, and the French were threatening to demand gold. And so one fine day, Nixon abrogated, essentially, our commitment, ended the Bretton Woods system. I remember that happened to be the day that I was leaving the council to go back to the University of Pittsburgh, because I had decided I could no longer ignore the likelihood that the president was mixed up in the Watergate scandal. And the chairman's assistant called me up and said, "Marina, be sure and listen to the radio tonight, because the president is really going to drop a bomb." So I hung up and turned around and said to my family, oh, the president's really going to drop a bomb tonight. And our daughter was about 8 years old, and her pigtails kind of stood up on end, and she hid under the kitchen table and said, he's going to drop a bomb here? So anyway, he did. He abrogated the Bretton Woods system. He put into effect the infamous wage price control program. And so there were two big economic issues on the table. One was the wage price controls, and because I briefly served on the Price Commission, I was kind of the public face of the wage price controls when I went to the council. And the second thing was that the United States tried very hard to develop a new blueprint for the international monetary system because the Bretton Woods system was gone. And that was my field. I'm an international economist. And I found myself serving on a group headed by Paul Volcker, trying to redesign the international monetary system. And we had an absolutely beautiful blueprint. It never got used because national politics intervened, not just ours, but the Europeans.
Sure.
So the two things that I was heavily involved in were kind of front and center in those days. Also, since then, the White House, as is so typical of many institutions, has kind of proliferated. Now there's not only the Council of Economic Advisors, but the National Economic Council, and the Treasury is deeply involved. So there's been a kind of metastasis of organizations around the president dealing with economic and the intersection between economic and political issues.
How would you describe the environment you experienced in the Nixon White House?
Well, aside from the little problem of Watergate, which gradually I could no longer ignore, it was very exciting. I mean, the odd thing that people forget about Richard Nixon is that almost every piece of progressive economic legislation that we have was passed, either passed or tried to be passed and didn't during the Nixon administration. I mean, the EPA, the EEOC, you name these alphabet agencies. And in fact, he and Daniel Patrick Moynihan tried to put in a negative income tax, and they couldn't get it through Congress, but they tried. And I remember a few years ago, Bob Dole made a TV series for public television in which he commented that there is absolutely no way that Richard Nixon could get the Republican nomination today because he was far too progressive. In fact, in many ways, his economics was to the left of Barack Obama's. And of course, he opened up China, and he made the first, was it SALT or START treaties with the Russians. So it was a very exciting time to be there, and it was with great regret that I left. But as I say, it increasingly dawned on me that he could not have been unaware of what was going on.
Well, and you make that point in your book that you felt, just as a matter of principle, after Watergate and all the revelations afterwards, you couldn't stay.
That's right. And I tried to tell this to Herb Stein, who was then chairman of the council, and a good friend, and a man of great personal integrity, but also a huge loyalist of the president's. And I tried to tell Stein that I was going to leave, and he simply didn't believe me. So finally, I wrote a letter of resignation to the president and sent it and left a copy on Stein's desk. And then he believed me, and he really did regard it as a personal betrayal.
And did he tell you that personally?
Yeah, pretty much. It was clear, let's put it that way.
Okay. You entitled that chapter in your book, The End of Innocence. Why was that like that for you?
Well, because, as I say, I had always, sort of taken these institutions like the presidency at face value. And I had tried for as long as I could to evade recognizing the fact that there was a very dark side to this presidency, which, as I say, had a lot of very exciting and progressive things going on. And it's in that sense that I meant the end of innocence. And, you know, ever since then, I've tended to look at institutions, whatever institutions they are, a little more critically than I would have before.
You move from there to years of incredible board service at some of the biggest companies in America. And it's interesting, you just made the observation about being critical of big institutions after you leave the White House. Manny Hanny was the first board that you joined, Manufacturers Hanover Trust. Westinghouse, you served on the board there, P&G. We talked about the university boards. This was really a time of fundamental social change for women in the 70s. And before we get into your observations about the boards and the companies, which you're very candid about throughout the book, can you just talk about what it was like being a woman sought for these board seats almost always? And were there any cases, in fact, in which you were not the first woman to take these board seats?
No, on the boards I sat on, I'm just running through them in my mind, I think I was always the first woman.
Yeah.
In fact, when Lynn Martin, who had been Secretary of Labor, joined the Procter & Gamble board, she says, I don't remember this, but she said, you know, Marina, you greeted me when I first came saying, Lynn, I'm so glad to meet you. I've waited 17 years for you, because I always wanted to be one of two or more women on a board of directors. The reason that I was courted by boards, I think, is because in the 70s, companies, big companies in particular, were beginning to feel the pressure to put women on their boards. And there weren't a lot of women who had the kind of experience and background that, I mean, nowadays there are plenty of women CEOs and high up in companies, but there weren't then. So when I had this rather high profile visibility at the CEA, suddenly companies wanted me, and I was courted by lots of companies, and I got to pick the cream of the crop. Manufacturers Hanover, by the way, has metamorphosed through 3 or 4 changes of name into what is now J.P. Morgan Chase. And I was on the board through all those changes.
And what were your observations about board service in general and the nature of the way corporations were being governed during this period?
Well, one of the things that really startled me is that when the first board I joined was Manufacturers Hanover Bank, and I hadn't the dimmest notion what distinguished a successful or a profitable bank from an unsuccessful or an unprofitable bank. So when I joined the board, I said, look, I really would like a short course in money center banking. And I said, before each board meeting, I would like to meet with the head of one of your major business units or one of your major staff units to learn a little bit about this. And they were very accommodating, and they set it up for me. But they acted as if I was the first person who ever asked. And I wondered how other people learned, and it turned out that you were supposed to sort of sit there and listen for a couple of years until it all sank in, and then start contributing. And of course, there was no way I was going to keep quiet for a year or two while I learned about banking. Now, of course, there's a whole cottage industry in educating corporate directors, and lots of both business schools and law schools regard this as a wonderful cash cow to give short courses of various kinds for corporate directors, but it was unheard of in those days. And that was really, people say, well, what was it like to be the first woman on a board, and how did they treat you? And yes, there were some initial looks of shock, and I still remember the little round Southern gentleman who came about up to my shoulder, who was head of Reynolds Tobacco. And we were talking, I mean, there was some conversation going on, and he said something, he said, damn, and then he looked up at me and said, oh, pardon me, ma'am. And I thought, you know, if you heard what I heard on the college campuses of the 1960s, you would not be so apologetic for that damn. But by and large, they treated me with respect, mm-hmm. and eventually actually began to take what I said seriously. So I didn't feel a lot of difficulties, but it was a wee bit lonely.
Did you feel in a unique position? Did you feel you could relate to the other directors, or not so much? I
did. I remember telling the chairman of Manny Hanny when he asked me to join the board, I said, look, I recognize that I'm a token, but please don't expect me to behave like a token, mm-hmm. because I promise you I won't, and indeed I didn't.
And they took you on.
And they took me on,
yeah.
yeah.
This was a time, the 70s, of enormous economic upheaval, political, social upheaval, regulatory change you're talking about. What did you observe about the nature of corporate leadership in the 70s in that kind of environment?
Well, what has happened, and it didn't all happen in the 70s, it's actually a process that still is going on today, and that is corporate boards began to take their oversight functions more seriously. They, yes, they became a bit more diverse. There were women and minorities and so forth beginning to join boards. But mainly, the heat was on them, and it started in the 70s when there grew up what's sometimes called a market for corporate control, where companies were merged, or there were hostile takeovers or whatever. And the notion of governance became more serious. This wasn't just the chairman's cronies voting yes. Although board votes usually tend to be still unanimous, but that's because you don't hold a vote till you know that you're going to get the support of the board. The haggling, if there is any, goes on before. Mm-hmm. And when Ross Perot voted no on the General Motors board when they bought Hughes, this was headline material. And of course now, as you know from reading the newspapers, the whole question of the role of corporate boards and what they're responsible for, and the whole question of executive pay and what kind of role the board should be playing. All of this now is much more front and center mm-hmm. than it was. Mm-hmm. And so I was there for a fair part of this revolution in corporate governance. It really wasn't revolution, it was more evolution. And of course, starting in, well, actually it started in the early 90s. And it started when Robert Stempel, the chairman of General Motors, was pushed out by the board. And then there was just a rash of CEOs being pushed out by non-confidence on the part of the directors, which is something I think had really never happened mm-hmm. before. And actually, Stempel's departure, by coincidence, happened within 6 weeks of when I left General mm-hmm. Motors. And I left for quite different reasons. I was tired of being Cassandra, telling GM, you know, unless you wake up and smell the burning pot, you know, you're going to be in serious trouble. And I couldn't get the top management to take their heads out of the sand long enough to see that their world was changing and that they would have to change. But Stempel was forced out by the board, and then the head of, American Express and a whole host of companies the same thing happened. And that was really unheard of at the time. And the process is still going on now of pointing out to corporate directors that they really do have a major responsibility.
Let's talk about your career at General Motors, about a decade and a half. A lot of that as vice president and chief economist. What took you to GM and why, and what did you find when you got there?
Well, it actually happened here. I was on a year's sabbatical at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences on the Stanford campus. Actually, now it's part of Stanford. It wasn't then. And Paul McCracken, who had been chairman of the CEA when I was there on the staff, called me and said, there's a man from GM called Roger Smith who wants to come and talk to you. His daughter's at Stanford Business School, so he's going to be out there anyway. And I said, fine, I'll ask him to lunch at the center. The center had wonderful lunches. And I suppose I was one of the few people on the planet that didn't know that this man was going to become the next chairman and CEO of General Motors. So he came and we chatted, and then he said, how would you like to be vice president and chief economist at General Motors? And I thought, my God, this guy was very blonde and he had very fair skin, and he was looking quite ruddy, and I thought, he's had too much sun. I mean, what an insane idea. But turned out he was serious, and I was, I'd been teaching for quite a number of years, and I was always up for a new challenge, and I had turned down several college presidencies, so it appeared that, as my children told me, apparently, Mom, that's not really what you want to do. And I think what intrigued me, well, two things. One, the company at that time was big enough to really affect the national economy, and I was kind of a macro international economist. And the other thing was that here I had this whole economic training, and I think of training in a field as kind of creating a mental filing cabinet into which you break down problems and then reassemble them. And I had this mental filing cabinet and the vocabulary that went with it, and I was presenting it always to a captive audience, the students. And I thought, gee, it would be interesting to see if this can be effective and persuasive with a non-captive audience who don't share my vocabulary or my mental filing cabinet or whatever. So I became intrigued. Now, actually, this was in January, and I didn't say yes until May or April, because it would clearly mean commuting marriage. Bob was teaching at Pitt. And as long as we had a child at home, I wasn't going to do that. Well, our son was already at Yale, but our daughter was in high school. And she, for a set of reasons of her own, wanted to go to boarding school. She did not want to go back to the school she'd been in Pittsburgh, which we were intending to go back to. So I thought, well, if she gets into the boarding school she wants to go to, which was Andover, then I'll accept the GM job. So she did, and I did. And that's how it all started.
What did you hope to do as the chief economist, and how did that align with what GM wanted you to do?
The chief economist before me, who retired, which is why the job was available, had really mainly been kind of an assistant to the chairman who wrote speeches for him, and so, or at least set out the content of the speeches. And I really wanted to make the economic staff a bit more useful to the operating side of the house. So I did a number of things. For one thing, I shifted the analytical framework of the staff from just focusing exclusively on the US economy to focusing on the global economy. I'm sure that bias came partly from my own background as an international economist, but also I was beginning to be convinced that this was becoming a global industry. Mm-hmm. And so I reoriented that staff in that direction.
It's because it's 1978 when you joined. The Japanese
Right.
invasion
Exactly.
had happened. This huge transition was starting.
That's correct.
The pot was on fire, as
The
you
pot
put
was
it
on
a minute
fire,
ago.
and the management kept insisting that, this was a temporary phenomenon and it would all go away. And then when the Japanese started to build plants here, they said, my boss, who was the vice chairman, said, well, wait till they have to work with American labor. We'll push them back into the sea.
We'll push them back into the sea.
That's
right.
right,
That's
yeah.
the title of one of the chapters.
One of the chapters, exactly.
There was just you talk again and again about the real lack of urgency
That's
at
right.
GM and understanding and responding to these competitive pressures. What was your observation about why that was happening?
Well, GM was so used to being the big kahuna. In fact, when I went to work for GM, I got congratulated by friends on going to work for Generous Motors, which is sort of the nickname. And, it wasn't bad at the time. It had more than half the U.S. market share. And they simply couldn't adjust to the fact that this was changing and changing rapidly. Now, Roger Smith did see, he in some ways had some vision of the future, but it was a vision that was, the things he tried to do to fix it were just not successful, and he was not capable of making mid-course corrections. I mean, he tried to do a lot of automation without recognizing that that was not the Japanese secret. He bought Hughes and EDS, hoping that these high-tech companies would crack the GM culture, but he treated them as financial transactions. He never really saw that to functionally integrate them into General Motors was a very different kind of job, and they never were functionally integrated into General Motors. And he brought in a lot of people from the outside at vice president levels, which had never been done before, hoping that would update the culture. But every one of those people he brought in, Betsy Anker Johnson, who was deputy director of Oak Ridge Laboratories. He brought in Bob Frosch, who had been head of NASA. He brought in Elmer Johnson, all kinds of very high-level people. And every one of us, male or female, either retired or left the company frustrated because we could not crack that culture. And don't misunderstand me, there were insiders who were trying to do the same thing, but there weren't enough of them to form a critical mass. And I remember I finally got so frustrated that I left, and I said privately, not publicly obviously, GM and the UAW are going to join hands and jump off the cliff together. And of course, that happened in a rather spectacular fashion.
And then we all became shareholders.
Yes, that's right.
We have a lot of great questions from the audience, so let me ask a few of those before we talk about what you've been doing since leaving GM at Michigan and in other places. You talk, I want to begin with this question because I just love it so much. You talk about what it was like to ride in the car with your dad, who was not a very good driver. What was a Sunday drive like with your father?
Well, my father was a notoriously terrible driver. He and my mother both got driver's licenses by going down to Trenton and taking the driver's test and then putting a $5 bill in a cigarette case and offering a cigarette to the cop. And they both got driver's licenses, but that doesn't mean they learned to drive. And I still remember, it wasn't just a Sunday afternoon, but I did once drive across the country with my father from Princeton to Santa Barbara, where he left my stepmother and me while he went off to Bikini for the atom bomb test. And I loved it because I had this chance to have, unbroken time with my father. But even though I was only 11, as in that picture, I had enough sense to be frightened for my life, that we would get there, and we did. But somebody once asked my father why he drove a Cadillac, because that was a very unacademic thing to do. And he said, well, it's only because no one will sell me a tank. And I guess the Cadillac was the closest he could come to a tank. And it is true that he managed to crumple a lot of Cadillacs and survive. Although on their honeymoon, he crashed the car and the windshield wiper went through my mother's nose, and she always swore that that had created a lifetime problem. Which in a way it did, because in those days, in order to prevent scarring, they gave far more radiation than anybody would do now. And so late in her life, she was plagued with non-life-threatening but very annoying skin cancers, which came from
the radiation. Wow,
which
amazing.
came from the fact that he had crashed the car into a tree, which he did with some regularity.
That's amazing. There's a card here. An old friend worked with your father and always referred to him as Johnny. Did anyone call him Johnny? Was he known as Johnny von Neumann?
Everybody did.
That's what I thought,
Yeah. I mean, in Hungarian, it was Jansi.
Yeah.
And then when he came to the United States, it became Johnny. And I don't know that I think people either called him Johnny or they called him Professor von Neumann. I don't know that anybody ever called him John.
Huh.
Except his brother Nicholas, who wrote, well, it's not quite a book, but wrote about his brother. And he was a very formal man, and he called him John, but I don't know of anybody else that did.
Here's a more substantive question. Do you know what the most radical vision of the future of computing was at IAS around the time of your father, and did it come close?
Well, I don't know so much about IAS. I know what my father, his radical vision. At some point, I guess it was right after World War II, he wrote a letter to Freeman Dyson, who was George Dyson's father and a longtime faculty member at the Institute. And he said, I'm now thinking about something much more important than bombs. I'm thinking about computers. Because his main goal, scientific goal for these very high-powered computing machines was in long-range weather forecasting and ultimately weather control. And he felt that in any future international conflict, it would be weather control and not bombs that would carry the day. And there is an institution, and I've forgotten now what the initials are, in Boulder, Colorado, which used high-powered computing to work on weather forecasting. And of course, what's happened is that computers have made possible much better short-term weather forecasting than there was before. But as I understand it, for long-range weather forecasting, it's still the Farmer's Almanac. And I guess the reason for that is something which hadn't surfaced when my father was alive, which was chaos theory, which says essentially, no, you can't forecast what the weather is going to be like. So in that sense, he would be disappointed. He always assumed that computers would be used only for scientific research, and probably a dozen of them in the world would do, maybe 20. Mm-hmm. The notion that, every single one of us would have a whole lineup of these electronic objects, some of them so small that you can hang them around your neck like a pendant, flash drives, and that they would be used for children to play games on and people to write love letters on, including love letters to people they shouldn't be writing love letters to. And that would have absolutely blown his mind. I just don't think. And of course, miniaturization, they hadn't come in yet. They were still using vacuum tubes, and the things were as big as a room. He also was very concerned that mankind would wipe itself out before 1980 because we really didn't have the social control to manage these technological marvels like hydrogen bombs and so forth. So he might be quite pleasantly surprised that we're sitting here talking about all this in 2013.
Did you hear Hungarian spoken at IAS at home? Was it Hungarian
I
a
don't
feature?
think they ever spoke Hungarian at IAS. Most of the people who worked on the computer with my father were Americans. He and my stepmother did often speak Hungarian to each other. My mother, of course, remarried an American, so I never heard Hungarian in her house. Well, she would sometimes briefly speak Hungarian to her parents, but basically there was no Hungarian in that household. My father and stepmother did speak Hungarian, particularly if they wanted to talk about something they didn't want to talk about in front of me, which meant that as a teenager I understood a certain amount of it, but it's all gone away. I'm told that I spent a year in Hungary when I was very small, I think about 2.5 to 3.5, when my mother was getting divorced and remarried. And I'm told that I spoke perfect German to the family and perfect Hungarian to the servants. But I came back here and went to an American nursery school, and within weeks I had suppressed both languages. And I really don't, like so many Americans, don't speak anything except Pidgin French today.
Okay, so here's one final audience question about your view as an economist, and then I've got a couple of final questions before we do a reading. Do you fall into the austerity camp or the stimulus camp?
Oh, like most economists, both. And what I mean by that is that we needed the stimulus. It probably should have been bigger and lasted longer than it did. At the same time, we need a specific and credible program for gradually reducing the budget deficit, which to my mind means both increasing taxes, and you can do it by closing loopholes without changing tax rates, or I guess my vote would be for a carbon tax, but I don't think I'm going to sell that anytime soon. And also by getting some kind of handle on the growth of entitlements, which, you know, before too long will swallow up more and more of the federal budget. So, as I say, I'm not just being facetious when I say both. And instead, we've done just the opposite. We've imposed austerity in the form of the sequester, which was carefully designed to be so awful that it could never happen. Well, guess what, folks? And we've made no progress at all on any kind of long-term reduction in the budget deficit. So we have it exactly 180 degrees backward.
When you look at the situation in Washington now, how do you feel? Are you optimistic, or do you think we've got the wherewithal or the will to work through these problems?
At the moment, no, we've got a mess. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's famous statement about democracy is the worst possible system except for all the others that have been tried. And right now, you know, democracy is at a low point, at least American democracy, because we seem to have worked ourselves into an absolute standstill. Now, I'm optimistic in the sense that I presume sooner or later we'll get over it. But right now, it's a pretty grim prospect.
The final chapter in your book you call Having It All, and you really do write in very optimistic and upbeat terms about your ability to have done that throughout your life. If you were giving advice to a young woman today who was just starting out on a career path, sort of like yours, imagine that, and she wanted to take some cues from that, what would you say?
Well, you can't possibly forecast how your life is going to turn out. They say, you know, men make life plans, women don't. Well, I'm not even sure very many men make life plans. But certainly nowadays, the notion, you know, of getting on one path and sticking to it is less and less in vogue. If you ask young people, do they expect to, work for one company or even in the same field all of their lives, the majority of them will say no. So I suppose professionally, it's the old Boy Scout motto, be prepared for what comes. On the personal side, they say, and I talk a lot in my book, as you mentioned, about what invaluable support my husband has given to me throughout my career and how it would not have been possible without that. And they say, well, what sort of partner should we choose? And I said, look, I can't tell you. I can't define for you what your ideal partner would look like. But I said I can give you one piece of advice, and that is never form a long-term partnership with someone because you think you can change him or her, because you won't. So those are two pieces of advice.
Okay. Good. So we're going to have a reading now. You've very generously agreed to read a passage. Do you know the one that you want to read?
I think I do.
Okay, good.
Yes, there it is. Okay, this is the very end of my book. And I said, through all the changes in my life and in the world that surrounds it, my father's presence has never been far away. Today I am a trustee of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he came as one of the first members in 1933. As they did in his day, leading scholars from all over the world make up a small, permanent faculty, free of all teaching duties, to focus on research, writing, and mentoring the large number of younger members who spend anywhere from one term to several years there. The Institute's board is probably the most intellectually exclusive collection of trustees in the world. Some of its members are billionaires, and by the way, Eric Schmidt and Charles Simonyi are two of them. Others are professors, but all of them have been chosen for their ability to oversee and nurture the Institute as a place where some of the world's greatest minds can operate in a serene, comfortable environment, unhindered by distractions. The tie that binds is in my mind whenever I sit with my fellow trustees in the glass-walled boardroom, which looks out on a picture book pond and the woods beyond, around which several generations of geniuses have strolled. I find myself conjuring up my father's astonished ghost, seeing his daughter sitting in the governing body of the institution he helped to found, the place where he spent most of his adult life and built his own prototype of the modern computer. While I'm summoning this ghost, my husband is tending his grave in the Princeton Cemetery, clipping, weeding, raking, and occasionally replacing a dead plant with a new one, a task he performs faithfully twice a year. The son-in-law John von Neumann feared would fatally cramp his daughter's future is doing his part to make sure the father's memory is not neglected. My father's presence was closest in 2003, when Hungary staged a national celebration commemorating the 100th anniversary of his birth. I was invited to participate as an honored guest, an honor that carried with it one of the most hectic schedules I've ever encountered. A couple of weeks after finishing treatment for breast cancer, I found myself not only giving talks about my father at internationally attended meetings of the Hungarian Mathematical and Computer Science Societies in Budapest, but also giving informal talks about him in English to students in schools all over Hungary. Thank goodness it's a small country. Bob and I were transported to every corner of it in the cramped elderly vehicle belonging to one of my father's self-appointed promoters, who enthusiastically acted as our chauffeur. Some of the schools were actually named after John von Neumann, but in all of them, students knew who he was and what he had accomplished, and had created various exhibitions to honor him. I tried to imagine American high school students according a long-dead mathematician the sort of veneration reserved here for sports and entertainment celebrities. That week of talking about John von Neumann's life and accomplishments in the land of his birth brought closure for me, a recognition that what I'd feared were the conflicting expectations, my father's, my mother's, society's, and my own, that had shaped my life had finally converged. I had fulfilled my father's moral imperative that I make full use of whatever intellectual gifts I had. My mother's ugly duckling had developed a swan's poise and self-confidence. A society where women head Fortune 500 corporations, where half the Ivy League universities and several of the leading public ones as well are headed by women, and where a female has been a contender for the nation's highest office, now allows the most daring and talented women expectations that far exceed mine. By their own lives, my husband and our children have given the lie to the fears of Bob's mother that all three would pay dearly for my career ambitions. My expectations of a close and loving family life have extended to encompass a third generation. My father's shadow has lifted at last. If we meet again, it will be in sunlight.
Marina, thank you so much.